There is a rookie wide receiver that is on the verge of a massive breakout. When comparing his profile to data over the last 12 years, some of the names he compares to are Keenan Allen, Julian Edelman, and Victor Cruz. And that's not all. Those are honestly some of the mid-range comps. You won't believe some of the names that are in the high-end group. And the best part of all is he hasn't had a blow-up game yet, so fantasy managers are getting him at a value based on trades that have happened in the last 24 hours. So the name of the wide receiver we're talking about? It's Zay Flowers from the Baltimore Ravens. He's currently the wide receiver 31, and he's averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game, but the data tells us there's room for much more. So we've got to go to the starting point here, and it's the talent profile. Then we'll talk a little bit about the utilization. How are the Ravens using him to this point? But when we look at the first round pick out of Boston College, one thing he already had going for him coming into the league, he was a high-end target earner, a 24% career targets per team pass attempt. That was better than any of his first-round draft pick peers. Yeah, better than Quentin Johnston, better than Jordan Addison, even better than JSN. And that is translated at the NFL level. He has a 28% target share. That's 12th best in the league and already wide receiver one worthy from a fantasy perspective. And when we dig into the details around the pecking order in this Ravens passing game, we see that it's really all about Mark Andrews as well as Zay Flowers. And if we go over to fantasylife.com, where for free, we have access to the utilization suite of tools, we can click on the game log view and look at this wide receiver room to get a better feel for the pecking order for the Ravens. And while Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashad Bateman have battled through injuries, we can also see by isolating down to targets per route run, even when Beckham Jr. and Bateman have been on the field, they just aren't earning targets. There is not a lot of competition here. It looks like this passing tree has really condensed around the two top-end target earners for the Ravens, and that is Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews. While we're on this game log view, I want to call out the next very important data point for Zay Flowers. That's his 30% air yard share on the season, only slightly below wide receiver one levels. He actually ranks 23rd in the league right now. But something really interesting has happened over the last two games. We saw in week 4, his average depth of target increased to 13.3. And then in week 5, it was at 16.8. And this makes a lot of sense with Flowers. His career average depth of target in college was 13 yards. In fact, 30% of his targets came 20 plus yards down the field. That is way above the NCAA average of 17%. This was not a trinket player in college. He attacked all levels of the field, and now that the Ravens are using him in that fashion, it unlocks additional fantasy upside. So now we have data on Flowers in two very critical areas. And I say critical areas because air yard share and target share, they correlate highly to fantasy points, and they're typically sticky to the player. So we want to look at things that we believe the player has ownership in that really matter for fantasy, and that's the simplest way to think about it. But first we have target share, 28%, and we have air yard share at 30%, but a 40% average over the last two games. So now we can take those two data points and we can look over data for the last 12 years and see how other wide receivers with similar underlying talent profiles performed. And to do that, I'm going to break things down into two buckets. The first comp group we're going to take, we'll just stay conservative. 25 to 28% target share. Note, we're at 28% right now on Flowers, so we are topping him out right there. And then from an air yards perspective, we're going to go 25 to 30%. Remember, he's at 30% on the season right now as well. And in that comp group, the average finish was wide receiver 14 with 16.1 points per game. That was Keenan Allen, as well as Victor Cruz and Julian Edelman. But what if this recent trend we're seeing with his average depth of target going up does lead to a larger air yard share than what we've seen over the first 5 games? Remember, he's been at 40% for the last 2 weeks. So in this bucket, I kept the target share the same, 25 to 28%, but bumped air yards up to 30 to 35%. Didn't even max it out at the 40%, put the cap on it at 35%, and we saw another jump. The average finish for this group was wide receiver 11. This group averaged 17.9 fantasy points per game, and when we look at the names in the comp group, we have Antonio Brown, Deontay Johnson, Stefon Diggs, and CeeDee Lamb. I find that really intriguing because these are not big 215, 220-pound wide receivers. They win with finesse. They create separation. And we look at the profile for Zay Flowers, it's actually very similar. And it gives us hope that he can be a player that continues to win at all levels of the field, like what we saw in college, because we've seen all of these players do the same thing. And that makes him a name that we really should be thinking about trading for in fantasy football. So just who are some of those names we are seeing fantasy managers move for Zay Flowers over the last 24 hours? We're going to jump into those, but let's remember, what are we trading for based on the buckets we just talked about? I think in worst case, you're getting what you have today. You've got a mid-range wide receiver 3, but we have a realistic chance of climbing into that mid-range wide receiver 2 area. And if things broke perfectly for Flowers, he could creep into that low-end wide receiver 1 range. So now let's take a look at some of the running backs that have been moved for Flowers. The first running back that popped up in the Yahoo trade market was Rachaad White. I think that's a pretty fair deal. White hasn't necessarily performed well, but he's in an offense playing better than expected in Tampa Bay, and he's locked into a significant role. Both of these players are gonna score fantasy points. I do think White still has a path to upside despite the fact he's been inefficient. But if I need to make a move and I've got an extra running back, that's the type of guy I am willing to move for Flowers. The next name was Jaleel McLaughlin. I think that one's a slam dunk. Javonte Williams eventually returning to the lineup. Samaje Perine also hanging around. So while McLaughlin looked explosive in his expanded role in week 5, I think this is one you just automatically take Zay Flowers. The next deal was for Jaylen Warren. Yeah, Najee Harris has had his struggles, but if I had to choose today which player is going to score more fantasy points this year, I think it's clearly Flowers over Warren. Warren needs some things to definitely break his way. He does have upside if Najee goes down, but remember, we've now looked at Flowers, and that's why it's important to look at the range of potential outcomes, because he could be that mid-range wide receiver 2 to even a low-end wide receiver 1 if things break right. So yeah, I'm moving him for Jaylen Warren. And the last name, Miles Sanders, battling injuries, might be in a committee, Chuba Hubbard getting work, Laviska Shenault now getting carries, and an offense that we're not crazy about. I think that's another one. It is a slam dunk moving Miles Sanders for Zay Flowers if I need a wide receiver. We also had a few one-for-one wide receiver trades that popped up. Those are always interesting to me, and it can be tough to make those sort of deals really work. But I do find it interesting because it gives us another data point of how people are valuing Flowers, because I think he's better than all of these players. The first one is Terry McLaurin. The second one is Josh Palmer. And then we finally have Jordan Addison. Yeah, Addison's going to have an expanded role while Justin Jefferson is out, but for the course of the season, I still prefer Flowers over all of those players.